There's a quiet moment that often goes unnoticed. Not the act itself, not the habit, but the feeling that arrives afterward. A small, indistinct heaviness, a sense of something having passed through the body without ever truly touching the heart. It does not announce itself as a problem. It does not ask to be fixed. It simply lingers. Sometimes as restlessness, sometimes as dullness, sometimes as a soft disconnection from one's own inner presence. Many carry this experience in silence, not out of shame alone, but because it feels difficult to describe something that lives between desire and emptiness. This story does not move toward blame. It does not move toward instruction. It moves toward noticing, toward the subtle ways repetition shapes the inner landscape, toward the spaces where sensation slowly replaces sensation, toward what happens when stimulation becomes a language for feelings that never learned how to speak. A pattern rarely announces itself at the beginning. It enters softly, as a small comfort, as a brief escape from the weight of being inside a human nervous system. At first it feels simple, private, contained, a moment of warmth in an otherwise complex emotional landscape. Over time, something almost imperceptible begins to shift. Not in behavior, not in frequency, but in texture. The moment stops feeling like a choice and begins to feel like a familiar road, one that the mind learns by heart, one that the body begins to expect. There's often no dramatic collapse, no obvious breaking point, just a gradual leaning. A leaning toward sensation when emotions feel blurry, a leaning toward stimulation when stillness feels uncomfortable, a leaning toward something that can be controlled when so much else cannot. It does not arrive wearing the face of excess. It arrives wearing the face of relief. For many, the first relationship with this habit forms during a season of quiet vulnerability, a time when curiosity meets loneliness, when stress meets limited language, when desire meets a nervous system that has not yet learned how to sit with longing. No one says, "This will become a place you return to." No one predicts repetition. It simply happens, because repetition feels safer than uncertainty, because sensation is easier to access than tenderness, because a predictable release asks very little from the rest of life. Underneath the surface, something gentler is often present. A wish to feel soothed, a wish to feel grounded, a wish to feel something definite inside an internal world that often feels vague. This is not a story about moral weakness. It is not a story about lack of discipline. It is a story about the nervous system discovering a shortcut to comfort, and like all shortcuts, it trades depth for immediacy. Slowly, the inner world begins to organize itself around this small, reliable doorway. Boredom quietly points toward it. Stress quietly points toward it. Fatigue quietly points toward it. Not as a command, as an association. The mind learns. When discomfort appears, this pathway reduces it. The body learns. When tension builds, this movement releases it. Over time, desire itself begins to change shape. It becomes less about connection, less about imagination, less about shared presence, and more about speed, more about efficiency, more about arriving at a sensation rather than moving through an experience. There's often a private noticing, a faint awareness that something once rich now feels thin, that the anticipation feels stronger than the satisfaction, that the moment ends faster than the longing that preceded it. But this noticing does not usually arrive with language. It arrives as a quiet dissatisfaction that does not know what it wants. Some experience a soft fog afterward. Not sadness, not guilt. Something harder to name. A sense of being slightly outside of oneself. A sense of having consumed something rather than participated in something. Yet even this feeling becomes folded into the pattern, because the same doorway that led to the act also promises to soften the aftertaste. The loop completes itself gently, not with force, not with crisis, with familiarity. In many inner histories, this pattern grows alongside emotional environments where certain feelings had no safe container, where tenderness was scarce, where curiosity was unmirrored, where stress lived in the background without words. In such environments, the body often learns to become its own regulator. It finds private ways to settle, private ways to discharge energy, private ways to create moments of relief. None of this happens consciously. Children do not plan coping mechanisms. Adolescents do not architect emotional systems. They respond, they adapt, they use what is available. For some, what is available is imagination. For some, it is fantasy. For some, it is repetitive sensation. And the nervous system, grateful for anything that works, keeps the map. Years later, the pattern remains. Not because it is still needed in the same way, but because the body remembers. There's often confusion around this. A quiet question: why does this still pull me? The answer is rarely dramatic. Because it once kept something manageable. Because it once helped something pass. Because it became a language long before other languages developed. This does not make the pattern good. It does not make it bad. It makes it understandable. And beneath the repetition, beneath the habit, beneath the sensation, there is often an unspoken wish. Not necessarily for sex, not necessarily for pleasure, but for a moment of internal quiet. For a moment where nothing is demanded. For a moment where the self does not have to be impressive, productive, or emotionally fluent. Just present inside a body that is feeling something. This is where the story quietly deepens. Not into condemnation, not into solutions, but into a softer recognition. That what looks like excess on the surface often began as a small attempt at care. Inside the body, repetition leaves traces, not visible ones, not easily measurable ones, but impressions. The nervous system is not a moral instrument. It does not categorize behaviors as healthy or unhealthy. It notices patterns. It notices what leads to relief. It notices what reduces internal pressure. It notices what produces a brief sense of ease. Each time a sensation reliably softens tension, small pathways grow warmer. Not in a dramatic way, more like footprints in soft ground. At first they fade, then over time they linger. Eventually they become easier to step into than to avoid. This is not compulsion in the cinematic sense. It is familiarity. It is efficiency. The brain quietly begins to favor what is fast, what is predictable, what has worked before. The body too adapts. It learns the arc of stimulation, the rise, the peak, the drop. It learns to anticipate the shape of the experience before it happens. Anticipation itself becomes part of the reward. Not consciously, not as a plan, but as a subtle leaning forward inside the nervous system. There's often a moment where pleasure and pressure begin to blend, where desire no longer feels like an invitation. It feels like a slight internal push. Not painful, not overwhelming, just present. A background hum. Some describe it as restlessness. Some as mental noise. Some as a faint ache that does not quite belong to any single emotion. The loop does not only involve the body, it involves attention. During repetition, attention slowly learns to narrow. It becomes skilled at locking onto specific imagery, specific rhythms, specific internal sequences. This narrowing can feel efficient, but it also reduces the range of what feels stimulating. Subtlety begins to lose its charge. Stillness feels longer. Gentle connection feels quieter. Not because they have become meaningless, but because the nervous system had been spending more time in louder frequencies. There's often confusion here. A person may notice that what once felt exciting now feels ordinary, that what once felt meaningful now feels distant. This can be interpreted as something broken, but more often it is something adapted. The system has calibrated itself to intensity, not intentionally, not maliciously, simply through exposure. Inside this calibration, a quiet contradiction forms. The act still promises relief, but the relief feels thinner than it used to. So the mind looks toward repetition, not for pleasure exactly, but for the memory of pleasure, not for satisfaction, but for the hope of it. This creates an internal tension, a space between expectation and experience, a space where disappointment quietly grows. Not loud, not dramatic, more like a dimming. Some notice emotional flattening, not numbness in the clinical sense, more like muted volume. Joy still exists, sadness still exists, but both feel slightly further away. This distance is subtle enough to doubt. Maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe this is just adulthood. Maybe this is just how life feels. The nervous system does not provide explanations, it only reflects usage. What is practiced becomes easier. What is rarely visited becomes less accessible. This applies to muscles. It applies to attention. It applies to emotional depth, not as punishment, not as consequence, as physics. Inside this loop, another quiet layer appears. Shame does not always arrive as self-criticism. Sometimes it arrives as secrecy, as a small internal closing, as a sense that this part of life should not be seen, not necessarily because of cultural rules, but because it feels strangely personal, almost fragile. This secrecy can increase isolation, not from others, from one's own inner experience, because when something is hidden, it is rarely explored, and when it is not explored, it remains undefined. Undefined experiences tend to repeat, not because they want to, but because nothing has named them yet. The loop, then, is not just about sensation. It is about unexamined familiarity, about a nervous system moving along a path it learned long ago, about a body seeking regulation, about an attention system trained toward speed. None of this is dramatic. None of this is catastrophic. It is quiet. It is gradual. It is human. And somewhere within this quiet machinery, something else occasionally flickers. A brief moment of noticing. Not a demand, not a decision, just a small internal pause. A sense of something about this feels thin. Not wrong, not evil, thin. This noticing does not try to fix anything. It does not argue. It simply exists, like a small light left on in an otherwise familiar room. That small light does not grow all at once. It does not expand into clarity. It does not turn into a plan. It remains what it is, a quiet presence, a subtle awareness that sits beside the pattern rather than against it. Nothing is forced to change. Nothing is demanded. Life continues. The loop continues. And yet something has been introduced. Not control, not discipline, but relationship. A person may begin to sense the space just before the familiar movement, not as a moment of choice, not as a test, just as a sensation. A faint internal leaning, a gentle gathering of energy. Sometimes this is noticed, sometimes it is not. Both are part of the same landscape. The noticing itself does not carry instructions. It carries curiosity. Not the sharp kind, the soft kind. The kind that wonders without needing answers. Over time, awareness begins to touch not only the act, but the emotional weather surrounding it. The tiredness, the restlessness, the quiet loneliness, the overstimulation of long days, the understimulation of empty evenings. These are not framed as causes, they are simply present. Like background colors behind the main image, the act remains, but it no longer stands alone. It exists within a wider emotional field. This widening to something gentle, it returns dimension. The experience stops being a single repetitive point. It becomes part of a broader inner ecosystem. Within this ecosystem, sensation is still sensation. Desire is still desire, but they are no longer the only signals being felt. Other signals begin to quietly register. Subtle fatigue, subtle longing, subtle emotional hunger that has no clear object. Not hunger for a specific person, not hunger for a specific outcome. More like a wish for depth, for contact with something slower, for contact with something that unfolds rather than peaks. This does not replace the habit. It coexists with it. No inner civil war is declared. No moral hierarchy is established. Just co-presence. Sometimes, after the familiar act, the body may notice more than it used to. Not just release, not just drop, but a faint echo of emptiness. Not in a tragic sense, in a spacious sense, like a room that has been vacated. This emptiness is not framed as failure. It is simply space. Space that previously went unnoticed because attention moved too quickly. Space that does not demand to be filled. Space that quietly exists. Within this space, old emotional textures may occasionally drift through. A memory of wanting to be held. A memory of wanting to be understood. A memory of wanting to rest inside another presence without performing. These memories do not arrive as stories. They arrive as sensations. A warmth in the chest, a heaviness behind the eyes, a soft ache that does not point anywhere specific. Nothing is asked of these sensations. They are not analyzed. They are not interpreted. They pass the way internal weather passes. Some days they are absent, some days they are faint, some days they are more noticeable. What changes is not behavior. What changes is the quality of contact with experience. Less automatic, less compressed, slightly more spacious, slightly more textured, not better, not worse, different. This difference does not promise transformation. It does not guarantee new outcomes. It does not offer a finish line. It offers presence. And presence is not an achievement. It is a condition that comes and goes. Just like habits, just like desire, just like awareness. The story then does not end with resolution. There is no final turning point. No moment where everything aligns. There's only a human nervous system slowly becoming acquainted with itself. Not all at once. Not completely. In fragments, in glimpses, in quiet pauses between familiar movements. Somewhere inside those pauses, something softens. Not the habit, not necessarily the frequency, but the relationship to what is happening. Less adversarial, less fused, slightly more honest, slightly more open. And that openness does not announce what it will become. It does not need to. It simply exists. Like a small window cracked in a familiar room, letting in a thin line of air, not to change the room, not to renovate it, just to remind the room that outside exists. And the story rests there, not finished, not solved, not healed in a dramatic sense, resting inside a gentle, unfinished understanding, breathing, quiet, ongoing.